The subject of today is a continuation of what I've been speaking last week. Last week, the heroine of my speech was Donna Grazia Nasi, in a way, the great lady in a great part of Jewish history. See, we had very few such grand ladies like she was. And to explain again, they were wives of somebody. They were people that were queens, inherited the realm or married into that. All these are things in itself. She is a great lady, which was possibly a great lady on her own, which is remarkable for many generations. Surely within what I call the time of place, and we are speaking again, our realm is still 16th century, and the basic questions are mostly that of we are living after the big shock in every sense of the expulsion from Spain in 1492, which meant to many things. One of them that Judaism as a group practically ceased in the Iberian Peninsula after existing there for about 1,000 years or more, because Jews were there for a great number of years, possibly when Spain was still a Phoenician colony, and Jews continued to live there for a long time, and some of the greatest intellectual, religious achievements of Judaism were there. So it stopped. But it wasn't just a simple, say, move of the people. We don't know. Now we come to basically to points which are speculation. We really don't know numbers, and we don't know the real percentages. We know that a fair number, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jews, left Spain at the time and went to other parts, mostly under the Muslim rule, the Turkish, mostly under the Turks or their allies or something around them, in the other side in the eastern side of the Mediterranean. There were some of the Spanish Jews who went into different places in Europe immediately or later. I mean, the Netherlands, in some parts of Germany. I mean, some Spanish Jews went eventually as far as Russia. But it took time for this. It wasn't a big wave. The big waves were mostly in the eastern part: Turkey, Greece, Egypt, in the great part, Eretz Israel. These were the huge numbers, and North Africa later. Many people there. Now the other part was those who remained, those who were. Basically, so to say, anusim. They were forced to remain to become Christians. Now, there we come to things that are philosophically, historically, and in other ways, full of questions. It is clear, and the people that wrote in those times, there were some Jewish writers that wrote about these times. They thought that the huge number of those who remained showed the spiritual weakness of these Jews, because they preferred their safety and in many cases their money and their positions over being Jewish, and so they stayed. Now, very small number, surely at the first generation, converted to Christianity with any kind of conviction. Most of them didn't care for Christianity, didn't believe in it, and perhaps didn't have any feeling for it. It changed with the times, because so many of these people remained in Spain and in Portugal, and things changed. Some generations later, we have some of the Catholic saints that were of Jewish descent, quite famous names there, and some people that were in a way moving the politics of these countries. But all these were problems of some kind of weakness, and one may say, in so many cases we know about the huge temptation. See, those people were not were basically those who remained. Many of them were people of the stronger, higher, richer families. And for them, it was a big temptation to leave everything, because in Spain they didn't allow them to take almost anything with them. And so it was with Portugal. And in Portugal, later on, they didn't even allow them to take their children, their little children, with them. The children had to stay and be converted and live alone there. So it is not. Even though in those times, even though people that were very, I would say, zealots, they could understand that the complexity of the situation, and basically what happened was, and that's why I decided to speak about the whole period, about 100 years from the expulsion and later, because those who could tried later on many of them to get out of the country, get out of Spain, and to regain life as Jews in other countries where they were allowed to. Now one has to remember, and that's a part of the story mentioning about Shlomo Molcho and others. The Inquisition was established mostly for that. The Inquisition had very little to do with Jews as such. Unlike, you can find it in some of our, I would say, rather ignorant political leaders. I mean, what can we do? We cannot force them to be educated. Our political leaders, I mean. But the Inquisition as an institution had very little to do with Jews. It had to do with converted Jews. It had to do with people that were, according to the canon law, were heretics. Were people that left the church, in whatever way they entered there. But this was the main. So the Inquisition was searching, trying, and to find all kinds of Jews that kept their Judaism, and that it was a kind of a fight, an unequal fight between those Jews, that some of them somehow managed to avoid the power of Inquisition. Some of them went as far as the New World later on, Brazil in one way, and many of the other Spanish colonies in other places. And again, until the Inquisition came also there. People went to many other places in other countries. And as we know, there were some Jews that remained in a miraculous, in a strange way, as Jews, even hiding there for generations. I mean, about 30 years ago and more, it's now a well-established fact, when it was found a whole Jewish community that lived as Christians for practically 500 years as hidden Jews. But they were clear about their identity. They hardly knew that there were any other Jews in the world, but they kept what they could keep of the mitzvot, and they continued to transmit the traditions and to go on keeping being Jewish. So up to modern times, in which now they have in this little town in North Portugal, they have now when they can do it, they have now a synagogue, and they have, of course, the fighting in the Kehillah, which becomes a very normal Jewish community. I mean, fights about ideology, about other things, but basically just to say that we found them almost by chance. I mean, and it could be a very different, perhaps a very interesting story about how many of them remained in different levels of knowledge and about who they are, about their identity in modern times in Spain and Portugal. Anyway, going back to the past, as I said, Jews try to get out of these oppressive places and to get out from under the rule of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was just searching for them. See, in many places the Jews had a legal existence, and they were not overly molested. I mean, overly molested. It wasn't that Jews were not molested, but everybody kicked Jews. That was almost a national sport of Europe, but not too much. I mean, Jews could exist somehow, but with those people that were converted into Christianity, they had either to make a public confession, which was something accepted, or to be burnt. I mean, both choices were not pleasant in any way. So now in these times, we're speaking about times in which, I mean, everybody knows that there are so many Jews there, and every understanding person believes, I mean, in Spain or Portugal, that of course they didn't really convert. I mean, you can't make people change their opinions and their ideas in the past just by a government order, or by doing what kind whatever it means for Christians, as theologically it surely doesn't mean much for Jews if water was sprinkled on them or not. Lots of famous stories about it, how Jews were laughing at that, at the ceremony and the meaning of it. Anyway, there were many Jews, and they were trying to get out. They could flee, which was not always easy. I mean, if they wanted to take something with them, their families, which was one problem, and later on if they wanted to take any property, which is, see, these problems were repeated in many other countries, in Nazi Germany in a different way, in other places, when Jews try to get out of a place and to keep some kind of their property, to take some of the property with them. So the easiest way, and that was the way that our heroes were doing, they went to Flanders in the Netherlands, which is now more or less modern times Belgium. The Netherlands was then it was a Catholic country. It became Protestant only later. And more than that, it was under Spanish rule completely. It belonged to Spain as any part of the Spanish Empire. But still, it was a different country. Everything was different, new there. People had a different way. So one of the ways that many Jews took was to get out to move from Spain into the Netherlands, and that they had later on when they could, many of them created basically the Jewish communities of these countries for many generations. But we are still speaking about the times when Jews couldn't do it. You see, later on, when say at least the Netherlands became Protestant, the Jews could revert to their Jewishness, and they could practice their religion freely. In fact, one of those strange stories was that about the end of that century, when they established a secret synagogue in Netherlands, and then the police came to arrest the people, and they arrested them, wanted to arrest them because they suspected them of practicing Catholic religion in secret. So the Jews, the people later admitted that they were Jews. Oh, if they are Jews, it's all right. So as Jews they were allowed. If they were Catholics, they would be arrested and possibly gotten other punishments from the not more. See, the difference between Protestants and Catholics wasn't about that the Catholics were deeper in bigotry. Bigotry was the same. It was just two different kinds of bigotry that hated each other. But that's not the point. But we are still speaking about earlier times in which the family, it was time, the family Mendes moved slowly but safely, as much as they could, into the Netherlands. That Donna Grazia, who was married to one of the Mendes brothers, was one of them, and then she later on moved farther and settled it later in Turkey, which was completely safe from her point of view. Of course, with huge losses, but again, we don't see, not only in history, but even in our times, nobody has real sums or real numbers about what they call how much property does a family have. See, even today it's very hard to find such things. We make estimates now. In any kind of estimate, these Mendes brothers were enormously rich, and I say enormously rich. They were, in a certain way, they were so rich and so powerful. If you compare them to some of the small Italian republics of the time, say they were possibly as strong as any of these small republics. See, the family alone. So I spoke about the story of Donna Grazia, who fled, moved into later on from Italy. It was the first move from Italy, and then to Turkey. Now, Don Joseph Nasi was then called João Miguez. He was a nephew of Donna Grazia, seemingly the son of a brother. He was born in the 20s of the 16th century, something like, say, 1520 odd, in Portugal, because they were Portuguese Jews. Eventually, there was no question to whom they belonged or what was their affiliation was. But officially, of course, they were Catholic, say, grandees, say, but so he joined his aunt in Flanders, and tried to work with her, doing all kinds of. He had connections, because even when he came there, he was possibly quite a young man, perhaps in his late 20s. Clearly, he was himself very bright, and he had that power behind him, and he tried to negotiate about, which was the main point, was to release as much money that he could from the hands of the government, the Spanish government, the other governments, the French government that confiscated a part of or at least kept in hold a part of the property. But so he was dealing with the rulers of the countries. The rulers of the countries tried as much as he could to do so. He wasn't successful formally, but seemingly, as you know, there were several things that he could do and other people could do on the table and officially, but they continuously, we don't have any numbers. We have estimates and guesses that seemingly they smuggled within the time very big amounts of money out of the Spanish rule. So they smuggled a great amount of money, and then when they decided that they cannot do anymore, so they took whatever they had, which was, as I say, it was perhaps possibly a fraction of the basic property, but it was big enough to become powerful. And they moved eventually, settled in Turkey. There in Turkey, it was known, he was then still Joao Miguez. He bought a palace there, one of the palaces. It's called Belvedere. That was his place, and he lived there all his life, more or less. He became much closer, and really, he became just a business partner of his aunt. But eventually, he married her daughter. So the connection was then complete. He was the nephew and the son-in-law of Donna Grazia. And we know the name, incidentally, because she survived him. She lived we don't know how much, but a few years after Don Joseph died, we know that her name was Reina, which means queen. So anyway, it was his wife. They together went on into continuing the work. And as I say, it was, on one hand, they engaged very much in commercial affairs, very much so. And they did it very well. It was the right time and the right place, and they were the right people of doing it. They still continue to do two things. One of them was to help the Jews to escape the Iberian Peninsula, which meant, look, they had, after some time, seemingly this family had a small navy of their own, commercial boats, ships, basically. So it was easy to use them for smuggling people out of those countries. They also did political work from the very beginning of trying to somehow to fight against the power of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition became more and more powerful, and because everybody could be suspected, surely everybody could be informed against, which was the usual way. And the people of the Inquisition were perhaps fanatics and and some of them were what they call real zealots. But it was still those people that it was far more interesting to deal with and to judge and to torment were the very rich people. So the people of the very rich families, it was easy to inform against them. I mean, you didn't need too much proof, even though the Inquisition was a bureaucratic, very legalistic body to its end. I mean, they were not like most of the what are called secret police in other countries. We have still some of their say written, very meticulous written what I call documents, which how much torture to do to somebody, and under whose supervision it will be done, by whom it will be done. Everything is there. There are protocols of the discussions, but anyway, they become too powerful, and they, of course, they weird to the stronger people in the government. Now, the number of Jews that now, because they had, say, officially they were now Christians, so there was no barrier to their advance. So these people became bigger and bigger. We know clearly, and we don't know it, but we don't know enough, how much of the discovery of the whole discoveries of the New World, including the voyages of Portugal to India, and to the voyages into America, we know that there was lots of Jewish money behind it. Possibly even, we don't know, and that's again a matter of speculation. You can imagine that people that had ideas then didn't commit them in writing, but there was a notion that possibly they were thinking or dreaming about creating a new haven for themselves in a far away country. In some places they even succeeded in doing it for some time. Sometimes before the Inquisition came, those Jews were there, and we know enough names, and some of the names that were behind the big passages of Spain into America were clearly what they call Jews originally, and as I say, but many of them were really very powerful. They were also, incidentally, very powerful also in the scientific way. The maps that they used were mostly made by Jewish astronomers and map makers. So it was not just a matter of sheer money, but it was money, power, political influence, and also. I mean, I don't want to go into it because it's a whole long discussion, which is a subject of perhaps of fairy tales. Several books written about it. See, was Columbus a Jew or not? Which is, let me just add one other things. The name Colombo was quite a common name among Jews in Italy. It still is. Colombo means a dove. But it was Yonah, which could very well be a Jewish name. But anyway, we know there are families with this name up to this time. Italian Jewish families with this name. So, and Columbus himself was a strange guy. And if you watch, there are people who wrote papers about his very strange ways of his signature and his seal, which is really full of mysteries. We don't know what it was, but anyway, I'm just saying, whoever they were, it was lots of Jewish money there. But these Jews were very powerful and were considered. So they became, on one way, they would become easy victims for the Inquisition, but they were fighting back. They were fighting back, and you really never knew. There were many. Indeed, it happened years later that it is found, incidentally, in the Book of History. It's not as a joke. Books of history that once the Grand Inquisitor of Spain had an idea that those new Christians that should be somehow separated, at least should be given special hats to mark them as different. So the story is that the Prime Minister came to the King with 3 hats. And he says, "Well, Your Majesty, 1 hat is for me, because I found out that I have Jewish blood in me. 1 hat is for Your Majesty, because you also have Jewish blood in you. And 1 hat is for the Grand Inquisitor, he also has Jewish blood in him." So it was so mixed up that it was so the fact that the family, like those Mendes who changed their name to Jewish names. So Joao became Yosef, which was perhaps his original name, and Donna Gracia, sometimes she was called Hannah, and they had a name which perhaps was the original name of theirs from the beginning of Nasi. Anyway, it wasn't so impossible to work against the Inquisition in one way, and all the time, Don Joseph Nasi was very much not just involved, but he became more and more involved with the Turkish ruler. Now, the Turkish ruler in his time was perhaps one of the most important, greatest Turkish sultans, and that was the Sultan Suleiman, who is called in Europe he was called the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent. In Turkey he was called the lawmaker, Kanuni, because he created a new word called a new code of laws for Turkey. Now, he was really one of the great emperors of the time. A huge country that was still expanding, and he was clearly, as one might say, clearly friendly to the Jews. I mean, he wasn't a Jew. He was a real right master, but he was friendly to the Jews. Incidentally, he is the one that is responsible for building the walls of Jerusalem. The walls of Jerusalem was built under his orders. So whether it had anything to do with any sentiment or not, but at least he was very clearly involved. Now, Don Joseph Nasi became important among the courtiers of the court, and again, which was one of the disadvantages. It was still an Eastern court. It wasn't a Western country, and the West at those times wasn't much better, much more orderly. So they have a court with advisors, with some people that had offices. I mean, as viziers of so and so, which didn't mean very much about who is doing what. And see, they were famous. There was always the problem about other members of the family, of the royal family, and the influence in those times it wasn't so big, but the influence of the harem. So the harems were a big source of influence, not just about the moods of the sultans, which is obvious, but it was the women of the core of the harems, especially the big ladies there, were always involved in political intrigue, in one level or another. There were some Jewish ladies that began as suppliers for the queens, suppliers of jewelry, of gems for the queens, became very friendly there and had a big political influence, not in creating huge things, but in changing situations within about individuals, sometimes saving somebody's life or condemning somebody else to punishment. So, but that was a part of the uncertainty of the government today. Now, let me just say, I know it's not a part of what I'm supposed to speak about. See, do such things not happen in our times, in other countries, say, some of them closer than Turkey, some of them more remote than Turkey, in which the influence of somebody that was not elected, the wife of so-and-so was not elected or was not chosen for rule, but it doesn't mean that she has no power. Say, sometimes she has more power than others, but all that is just as a note about the complexity of the thing. Now, Don Yosef became easily, see, one of the chief people to advise the king, and you can see the combination. He was a young man. Again, I don't know of him. I don't know if there is any kind of a picture, but he was a young man, clearly. He knew several languages, obviously. See, moving from one country to another. He had also the advantage of, he was one of the very few people for Turkey that knew European politics inside and out. See, he wasn't. You see, here comes a person that was in a way connected with the Portuguese and the Spanish courts, that had to deal with the people there, that knew all what's happening in these countries, and he's now becoming the advisor of the king. So the king, he was very influential. There were times when other ambassadors, and we have writings of other ambassadors, they thought that he is the most important person in the Turkish court. See, his advice, his ideas were followed, and sometimes they didn't even know why, but they followed his advice. So he was very powerful at the time. He later on, the Emperor Suleiman died, and then began a struggle between the children about the continuation. Who will be the next ruler? Now, at that time, there were several contenders, several sons of the Suleiman, and Don Yosef helped one of the sons, Selim. He helped him very much. I mean, again, with whatever he could, which means, I mean, I didn't add to all these things, all his qualities, also the money that he had, which is sometimes helpful for convincing people, for making people change their minds, and so on. Anyway, he helped the Sultan Selim. The Sultan Selim became the next ruler of Turkey. His brother was in a way put into exile. One of them was put into exile in Italy, and he was living there. Not in prison, but in a respectable kind of imprisonment. See, So anyway, Selim was the Sultan, and Selim felt very thankful to Don Yosef, which meant he gave Don Yosef many things. One of them was he gave him lots of licenses and openings commercially. He was, in a way, he held the business of several other things there. I mean, he had as a monopoly on basically on business with one or two other countries. Some of them big countries at the time. For some time he was perhaps had the sole or a big monopoly of the commerce with Poland. Poland was then also an empire, and they were touching. See, Turkey and Poland were touching, not then in animosity. The wars became much slightly later, but it was this time. So it was big money. He also appointed Don Joseph Nasi as the Duke of Naxos. Naxos is an island near Greece. It was for a time. It was a center of different islands, and it was of great importance in Greece itself. There was traditionally, for many years, there was some kind of independent suzerainty of Naxos as a separate unit, and Don Yosef was given the title of the Duke of Naxos, which is he retained to end of his life. Seemingly didn't have children. That's what again. If he had any, we would possibly remember them. So, but he was the Duke of Naxos, and because of the interesting situation of Turkey there, such a duke, and there were people there were rulers of Albania and rulers of Greece and rulers of other places. They had a choice, either to go to those places and to try to crave for themselves, to carve for themselves a power, an independent power, like Muhammad Ali that became eventually the ruler of Egypt and the ruler and the father of the kings of Egypt for 150 years, was one of those people, one of the rulers that was appointed one. There was Muhammad Ali of Yanina, another place. So there were people like this. On the other hand, it meant that such a person doesn't have his ties with the court are not close enough. So, for example, not only Don Joseph Nasi, but many others, they never left Turkey. Even though he was the Duke of Naxos, he never visited Naxos, because he thought it is far more important to keep his place near the Sultan than to be in Naxos. Naxos is still a small island with, say, a few thousand people and so on, with commerce and other things, with history and many other things. He thought it is safer to be in Istanbul and to be in the court. Now, in the court itself, let me just add two things about it. In the court, he was clearly not only on his own enterprises, he was clearly, I would say, heading the war party of the Turkish Empire. He basically wanted the Turkish Empire to be more aggressive in many fields, and to be more aggressive in Europe. He was, from the very beginning, trying to defend the 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 revolt of the Netherlands against Spain. And of course, he did it not just because he had any special sentiment there, but this revolt meant weakening of the Spanish Empire. And when he spoke about it, it wasn't just revenge. See, it was a part of it was perhaps revenge against Spain and for his own problems and for many other people's problems, but still, it wasn't it was the only part. When he tried to convince the Sultan, it was clear what they call politics. It was the Turkish Empire and the Habsburg, which was later on the Habsburg Empire, the Spanish Empire, still under the great kings were kings of Spain and other countries. They had to come to some kind of a clash because they met in too many corners. So Turkey eventually took over most of North Africa, which belonged to others. Sometimes it was under the rule of Spain. So North Africa was for a long time under Turkish rule. So that was part of the Turkish expansion. There was a time almost when the Turks ruled most of the Mediterranean. They had, so that was one of the things. We know, for example, something which perhaps had to do with his position. For about a year's time, there was a special tax of every French ship that came to Turkey to give many, perhaps 20% or 30% as fines to repay the money that they confiscated from Don Joseph Nasi. So the Turkish government was levying this money and giving it to him. Later on they changed it. Possibly it was too much. But as you see, he was powerful enough to move them into that. And he moved also, he tried, which eventually they did, but somehow he tried to convince the Turks to have a greater power and to conquer Cyprus, for example, which was then a kind of a Christian, perhaps a combination under Italian rule, with some of the ancient, let's say, the early kings of Cyprus that were the kings of Jerusalem in the past. But anyway, he was trying to do that. He tried to conquer Malta. Which again, as a point in the Mediterranean, there were main points. In fact, a great part, and that is to do with history, we don't really know what would happen, because it seems that the Sultan liked him and trusted him, because they were in a way allies at the beginning. What could be that if he could be more successful in this aggressive politics of there, but then there was one of the biggest naval defeats of Turkey. It was a battle of Lepanto, in which the Turkish navy was crushed. It was crushed by a coalition of the European Christian powers, but they didn't recover completely from this defeat. You see, Turkey could not build what the country needed in building a new navy, even though there was they were using for many years one of the they used a combination of pirates and you see pirates under the Turkish protection to keep the Mediterranean in their hands. Like incidentally at about the same times, if you know about it, in England, the English government did exactly the same thing. It had all kinds of pirates, like Drake and others. That some of them were, you never knew whether they were generals, or say they were admirals of the regular army, or they were just pirates that became what they call given more official power. But it was done seemingly by all the countries. So it was the man with a strange name. Again, we don't know very much about it. A name with a funny name of Khair Adin Barbarossa, who was the leader of those Tunisian and Algerian pirates that were really ruling the great part of the Mediterranean. But as I'm saying again, the Navy never recovered, and so it had many results, and some of them were, it was perhaps weakening the power of Don Joseph Nasi as a head of the, I would say, may call it the war party in Turkey. Now, that had to do with ups and downs in his own position. There were, we know about him, he was accused by another Jew at the time for all kinds of things, and he was suspected by the government, the Turkish government, to give you some notion. This other Jew, that was a former doctor of Don Joseph, was then excommunicated by all the rabbis of Turkey because, as I say, he just did damage because possibly of personal demand, the personal revenge. But anyway, I'm saying Don Joseph, because he dealt with such big politics, so because of that, he was just a simple person who was doing his little work in quiet. It was like when you compare it to many other things, the decisions of big countries like Japan in the Second World War, to move to one with the peace party or the war party meant changes, global changes. In that time, it was at least changes that meant very much for Europe in general. So, as I say, he was up and down because of that, and as I say, his basic idea was perhaps one of his basic desires, and he tried to make all kinds of affiliations and treaties and others with other powers in Europe to break Spain, which was then the very big and very powerful empire. So that is the man, as I say, in politics. Now, he was, his importance in the Jewish stories, not just because there was by chance a Jew that was involved in international politics, but he was all his life. Like in fact, the work began by his aunt, but he continued very big scale. Because first of all, he was a patron of learning and literature. He supported a great number of yeshivot all over Turkey, Eretz Israel, and perhaps Egypt. He supported them. He supported many authors that we know about, of the contemporary authors of the time, and many of them we know it because they have written their thanks in their books. Some of these books were quite important books. He seemingly also helped some Maranos at the time to do their scientific or literary work. So this was one of the things that he had done. Incidentally, this didn't stop with his death. But on the other hand, one of the things that is many a time mentioned is it began somehow by his aunt, but she died. He continued and he kept a concession over the city of Tiberias. He really built the city. He built the city, the city of Tiberias. It was basically up to the time mostly a ruin. See, like many other places all over Eretz Israel. He thought it had great potential, and he tried to create there, not only to call Jews to come there, to build it, to cultivate it in every sense, not just scholarly, but commercially, industrially. So he tried all kinds of things. So in that sense, he was, again, as far as we know, he never visited Tiberias. See, he possibly couldn't afford politically to do such a long voyage and to be absent from the seat of power. But he supervised, he paid for building the walls of the city. The walls of the city were built by him. The city basic buildings were built by him. He called the first people in there, and whatever happened to the city, he and his followers, it was in a certain way. See, again, remember that we are speaking about 16th century. He tried to do something that is. We know things like this happening 200 years later, and 300 years later, but this was one of the big attempts to rebuild Eretz Israel. See, now, as I said, people didn't write memoirs at those times enough about to explain how big the plans, or how big the dreams are. He clearly had big plans and big dreams. Not all of them became materialized, but still, he wanted to rebuild the country, not just to have one or two or three yeshivot here. He wanted to rebuild it as a country. So he took this place. It was, in many ways, it has a background. You could have and it did have some kind of fishing, some commerce, it is not too far removed from many other places, and it could be a beginning of creating a new life here. In fact, if you think about it, was after a gap of many hundreds of years, he was the first man to try to build the country, to try to build it, not just as they say, writing pamphlets about it, or so he tried to do something very true, very real about it. In that sense, did he have any dreams? Or was he thinking that being a duke, the Duke of Naxos, could lead to be the Duke of Eretz Israel? We don't really know about it, but we know that he did it. See, we know that he did it. He really built this city, and with ups and downs. It wasn't easy, and it was always under such a great protection. With all in all, it became eventually one of those what are called Arba Artzot HaKodesh, the four holy lands of Israel. See, it was Tzfat, Tzfat, Tiberias, Jerusalem, and Hebron. And Tiberias was, for many years, a very important center. Look, we don't know enough about the person as a person. And I'll come just to some strange kind of a finish about it, but we don't know. We don't know because the idea about that there are places in the Gemara where it says that the redemption will begin with Tiberias. So did he think about it? Or was it just a matter of, say, of looking at a map and picking up by a chance point on the map? Was he really thinking about it? That the beginning of the Geulah begins there. So he wanted to begin at that place where the beginning is supposed to be. So we really don't know about it. But as I say, we know that that's what he did. And as I said, even after his death, his work didn't stop altogether. His wife still was a great patron of the Jewish literature. Many books are really printed by her. I mean, by her orders, by her money. It didn't have a continuation, but it is one of those unusual stories. Let me just add something else about the man. All in all, we have one thing that he did write. He wrote a book. See, he wrote a book, and it's an interesting book because it is. I don't know if it was written originally there, but it is now in Hebrew. It's a book about a discussion and perhaps trying to fight against astrology in the time. He thought that astrology is not a true science, it's not a true knowledge, and so it's a whole book that is not especially Jewish book. Even though when you see the cover of it, it looks like one of those books, and they say that he is writing becharifut ubekirut, say all the ways that you speak about Jewish sources, but he spoke. It was really the subject was about astrology, and he says that it is possibly kind of his version of discussions that he had with some non-Jewish scholars about the subject. So the man was. It is not strange, but that a person like this was not just confined to doing business or making political intrigues. He was a man in himself. Now, what were his dreams? See, what were his dreams? Was he really trying to do something? Say, as to be almost like the first Joseph, kind of a savior of his brothers. He tried to, surely. He tried in a position that was slightly similar to that. Now, his impact wasn't so big, surely. He didn't do all of those things he could. He still, as long as he worked there, as long as his hand was felt there, it was still helping the Jews all over places. Those very delicate places in Europe where they needed help. They needed help. They helped to help some of the Maranos, the Anusim, to come back, which was another part, and to try to create something on his own. So here's the man. It's kind of in that sense, it's like the story of Joseph, a prince on his own right. See? He was a prince not only by our acknowledgement, but he was considered so by the nations. And he was of a great power. And he tried to move also the great powers of this time. Not completely successful. Again, nobody really did perhaps can do a good research about how much his impact, say, of supporting the revolt in the Netherlands helped to help the beginning of the destruction of the Spanish Empire. We don't know how much he was involved in what they call in French politics or in all kinds of Italian politics. As I mentioned, we know that he was involved. That still in connection with his aunt, with the idea of creating a boycott against one of the Italian republics that was not nice towards Jews. So he was, as I'm saying, not playing with little things. He was trying to move countries, to move power. Successful, unsuccessful, but it's a personality himself. In that sense, very much of like Joseph, a kind of a dream prince.